This miniature was primed with an airbrush using Vallejo's gloss black primer followed by a zenithal spray of white ink. Before I head inside to my painting desk, I make a quick stop by my Proxxon hot wire cutter to slice some thin plates of XPS foam. I cut varying sizes and pick the one that best matches the depth of the cobblestone around the lamppost and under Sophie's feet. These were actually two miniatures in a single blister that I decided to combine on a single 90 by 52mm base, so I'll be using this XPS foam to create more cobblestone to tie them together. With an X-Acto knife, I cut stones of roughly equal size to the ones on the molded miniatures and glue them on using superglue. Now, just be aware that superglue in large amounts can melt XPS foam, which in turn technically does release some toxic vapors. However, I'll be working in such small quantities that it'll be negligible. If I had a baby or a hamster right beside where I'm working, I might be a little more cautious, but it's just me, so I'm not concerned. With the stones adhered in place, I use an X-Acto knife to carve away any overhang before using a pen to trace in between each of the stones. This will create a slight groove between each of them, particularly where I glued any too close to each other. As a precautionary step, I next thin PVA glue with water and coat the XPS foam stones. When this dries, it'll harden the foam slightly. And, while the glue is still wet, I add a little pinch of small sand to help fill the larger gaps with tiny debris, as if it were some of the stones crumbling on the edge from repeated traffic. I then prime and dry brush the stones up so that they match the airbrush work I did previously. Now, a smart man would have done the stonework prior to any of the airbrushing steps, so the airbrush can make short work of painting the XPS foam. But a smart man I am not, and I caused myself an additional 45 minutes of unnecessary work. From here, I move on to the base coating stage, applying Army Painter Speedpaints all over the miniature. For the flesh and back of the wings, I ended up applying two Speedpaints, one to slightly tint, and the second to bring the color more in line with what I want. The small details were not base coated with Speedpaints, as I hadn't decided on what colors I wanted to use on them. While base coating the flesh, I noticed that I missed one mold line during the cleanup, and to my horror, it is a very noticeable mold line on the upper part of the miniature. I had a choice here, ignore it or clean it up. And trying to get better, I forced myself to clean it up now. Coat it with the light gray primer, and then once dry, reapply the speed paints I used for the flesh. And unsurprisingly, it ended up looking like a can of smashed ass. At least for now. From here, I move on to the general highlights and shades. To keep the runtime of this video shorter, I'll only be showing the steps for the flesh, pink clothing, black clothing, painting of the words on the sign, and the light in the street lamp. The hair is painted the exact same way I did on the Christmas Sophie video, which you can see in the top right corner of your screen now. The link will also be in the description for this video. Although most of the arms and legs and her nether regions will be covered in black clothing, I paint them all as if they would be left bare. I intend on trying to paint a black sheer fabric for her leggings, sleeves, and panties, and painting them bare now will give me the underlying flesh tones, while simultaneously giving me extra practice on highlighting and glazing. Each layer is thinned to a glaze, or pretty close, and applied numerous times, usually 3 to 6 applications per color, with each subsequent application covering slightly less area than before. For the flesh particularly, the last few highlights are only applied to her face, shoulders, and bust, and as I get to the brightest colors, I apply very little, to the point of I'm only adding it as small dots or very short brush strokes. Since most of the work from this point on will just be basic layering and highlights, I'll hold my tongue for a spell and return later. I hope you enjoy the music. I'm back. This is the first true highlight on the pink clothing, with the previous color being more akin to the base coat. I add this highlight in mostly as hatching lines, particularly on the long portions of the dress thing. For the boots, I instead try to highlight it in a connecting zigzag pattern that is, well, connected, to help give the impression of a more reflective material, such as latex. For the black clothing, I painted the garter portions in solid black, and the rest of the work on the leggings, arm, choker, and panties I did with several very light and thin passes of a semi-transparent blank ink. This was the most nerve-wracking part of this project, as I never try to use black ink in this manner. In the end, it didn't come out terrible, and with more practice, I could have a cleaner end result. For the text, I didn't do anything special. I first wrote out the letters on paper as tiny as I could, making sure that the size of the font would fit cleanly enough on the sign, and then I went straight to painting them on, trying to keep the same respective height and widths for each character, matching with what I sketched out on paper. I then went back with a lighter color to add dot highlights here and there on the letters. Since this was the Bourbon Street Sophie, one of the signs had to, of course, be Bourbon Street. The other, I opted to use a street referenced by one of my favorite bands. Sophie here knows that her friend Charlotte is hard at work when that red light is on down the road at 22 Acacia Avenue. With the signs done, I move on to the lamplight and base coated it black, following this with increasingly smaller glazes of red and then orange. I then finish it off with a touch of yellow in the center. And this is where I stopped. I like the bright colors of the hair and the colors used in the flesh, but the highlight shapes on the flesh could be improved, particularly on her chest. The black sheer clothing isn't the worst thing in the world, but if I hit it with anti-shine matte varnish, it would look pretty bad, showing some definite splotching. The glossiness of the black ink is trying its best to save it, however. But it's not all doom and gloom, and I definitely am happy with how the eyes came out, as well as the pink clothing. The wings could use a little more detail, but I did come up with a different manner of painting them, and I think with a few tweaks this might be how I paint bat wings going forward. Ultimately, I'm most happy with how the lamppost and sign has come out. I've been integrating painting on words on previously painted miniatures this year, and this is by far the best that I've done so far. The highlight shapes on the posts are also amongst some of the best that I've done, and the painted in lamplight isn't bad either. For lessons learned, I need to get away from the speed paints unless I'm doing batch painting. The reasoning for this is twofold. A, because it tends to have splotchy spots which I have to fix with glazing, which adds additional work, and B, because it tends to tear away Liquitex ink that was previously added, especially from airbrushing, as seen here. Alternatively, I can plan to not use Liquitex inks for the zenithal phase when using speed paints, or at the very least varnish the miniatures in between the zenithal ink and speed paint stages. Concerning the base, I should have cut the foam bits and adhered them on before I did the airbrushing. That way the priming and zenithal highlights would have taken care of the initial painting for all of the cobblestones. This poor planning resulted in 45 minutes of additional and unnecessary work. And finally, in my rush to get this finished for a Mardi Gras release date, my dumbass completely missed painting the tassel and feather dangling just below her right hand. This is still left untouched after the airbrushing work at the start of the video. I also forgot to paint in the words on the back side of the signs. And that'll bring this video to its end. I hope you learned something or inspired to brave Bourbon Street on your lonesome late one night. Perhaps you'll stumble upon this winged beauty, and perhaps you'll even emerge unscathed, having experienced an unforgettably passionate... No, you're definitely not going to survive that encounter. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, and if you like the content of this video and would like to see more, you can easily support the channel by liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing. I'm Jim with Working with Miniatures. I'm truly grateful for your time, and I bid you a fond farewell. Until the next video.